Thank you for this lovely opportunity. I greet you from the traditional homelands of the Lenape people, and I am currently in New Jersey, and I also acknowledge that my institution, Rutgers University, was built with the labor of enslaved African people, and I acknowledge the their suffering and my own privilege in relation to these histories. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to be speaking about this project that's very close to my heart. Relational Undercurrents, Contemporary Art of the Caribbean Archipelago was organized for the Museum of Latin American Art, or MOLAA, in Long Beach, California. It originally included over 80 artists from the Caribbean islands and their diasporas. The exhibition was part of Pacific Standard Time, LALA, a wide-ranging funding initiative by the Getty Foundation aimed to generate deeply researched exhibitions to showcase Latin American and Latinx art in Southern California. Promising to be paradigm shifting, the project launched in 2013 and the exhibitions were presented in September 2017. The Getty funded something like 45 exhibitions, but they welcomed others into the broader initiative, so there were over 70 shows on view. They range from a blockbuster exhibition of pre-Columbian art to exhibitions of 21st century art and new commissions. Most of the shows addressed are of the post-World War II era. Among the most visible of them were exhibitions like Radical Women, Latin American Art 1960 to 1985 at the Hammer Museum, Making Art Concrete, works from Argentina and Brazil in the Colección Patricia Felsa Cisnero at the Getty, Home, So Different, So Appealing at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and Visual Voyages, images of Latin American nature from Columbus to Darwin at the Huntington. And part of the reason that these were especially prominent is because they were exhibitions that were in some of the major museum spaces in the city. Long Beach, California is a city adjacent to Los Angeles, but which feels much further because of traffic. Because of its location, Relational Undercurrents was not one of the most high-profile shows of the initiative as a whole, but it was very well attended with over 90,000 people going to see the show. And then it traveled. It had 4 additional venues. The exhibition from the initiative that to me had the deepest affinities were not the blockbusters, but quieter shows like Circles and Circuits. The only other Getty funded exhibition of Caribbean art in PST, it was on contemporary Chinese Caribbean art. Ashe Bahia, the power of art in an Afro-Brazilian metropolis at the Fowler Museum at UCLA. Axis Mundo, talking to action on social practice across, Axis Mundo, queer networks in Chicano, LA. Talking to action, art, pedagogy, and activism in the Americas, and Mundos Alternos, art and science fiction in the Americas. And so these were all at smaller museums, and they had nice affinities with Relational Undercurrents. Talking to action was on social practice, Mundos Alternos on science fiction. And of these, Talking to Action and Mundos Alternos, like Relational Undercurrents, problematize the idea of Latin America as a geographic given by focusing on diaspora in ways that deconstructed traditional boundaries. One of the big topics of conversation around PST-LA was precisely the subject of diaspora. The population of Los Angeles is over 50% Mexican-American, or Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, as many Mexican descendant Californians identify. The initiative had underscored the inclusion of US Latino or Latinx art in its tagline, but many people in the Chicano community felt that it had not gone far enough. one Chicano art patron commented that only 19% of the artists in the initiative were Chicanos. And that seemed like a very high number to me, but not so much to the local community. And so what I show on this slide is several exhibitions that were exclusively of Chicano art. And what you can see by the titles is that they tended to be individual artist retrospectives. And the Axis Mundo exhibition on queer networks was not really acknowledged by the community as a for its radical contribution, and instead a lot of discussion focused among community members on what other solo shows people wanted to see. And I found that conversation a little bit frustrating from my end, given that I'd made a very large effort to include, to have a large show and to have a large representative example, because it's read to me as though there was a less, at least among the kind of local communities, perhaps less interested in other diaspora communities but their own. Later, as I mentioned, I found out that there were over 90,000 people who visited. And so that, in a way, I'm really talking about conversations about the Pacific Standard Time Initiative, where art patrons and people who were following the art scene in Los Angeles attended, but publics went in great numbers, and there was a very positive local response to the show. Relational Undercurrents set out to challenge the conceptual boundaries of Latin America, especially around the theme of the initiative, by calling attention to the exclusion of the Caribbean from a Latin American imaginary. On one level, it contested the assumption that Latin America is comprised of the Spanish-speaking countries of the Americas and Brazil. And on that note, it was gratifying at the opening celebration party for PST, and this is a photograph taken of the Getty Museum at the opening night, that the flags of all the countries of the Americas were projected on the facade. And here we can see the flags of Jamaica, Mexico, and Nicaragua. But most of the exhibitions of the initiative didn't try to break with the continental bias of Latin America. And even when then there were significant exclusions among Latin American geographies. So for example, this is the list of artists from the Radical Women show, and it was emblematic of the mapping of Latin America that took place throughout the initiative, because you can see that there were people listed by country, and that there are significant omissions even among the Spanish-speaking countries. So omitted were the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and that was a large omission because El Salvador had the largest Salvadoran diaspora outside of the country lives in Los Angeles. Bolivia, Ecuador were not represented, and neither were places like Belize, Haiti, and most of the Caribbean islands in general. I think it was only Puerto Rico and Cuba among the islands. And indeed, the list is a pretty good indicator of the significant omissions throughout the initiative. The Andes and Central America were all but absent, with the notable exception of an exhibition in Santa Barbara that focused on Guatemala. And this is something that I've thought about a lot and written about a lot, because as I kind of reflect back on relational undercurrents, one of the kind of really glaring issues is that the African diaspora was really minimized. And in Latin America today, there are 130 million Afro-descendants. It's a huge population. And the number of people taken into slavery were the numbers that reach Brazil, the Caribbean islands, South America, Central America, Mexico were staggering and very much larger. I think 90% of enslaved people went to places other than the United States. Maybe that number is higher. It's even more like 94%. So in that regard, the exclusion of Afro descendants was something that I don't, as I was working on the exhibition, it was in the context and in dialogue with the broader initiative. But once all the exhibitions debuted, it was hard to actually find many Black artists, except in specific shows like the one Ashe Bahia at the Fowler, and then at the exhibition Circles and Circuits of Chinese in the Caribbean that included people who were Afro-Chinese. And going back to this list from the Radical Women, although I myself was asked to provide a listing of artists according to nationality, I resisted. On the one hand, about half of the artists who I included in the exhibition live in the diaspora, and identifying them with a single nation state would have been misleading. And on the other, relational undercurrents emphasis on the archipelago as a structuring principle was a means of contesting frameworks dependent on borders, and in particular to the initiative, the perceived borders of Latin America, and the idea that that Latin America has a kind of is a continental territory. So I consider that a continental bias. And again, I think the bigger bias in retrospect is anti-Blackness, or, you know, to put it kind of more gently, exclusion of Black people from the initiative, but also from the very consciousness of Latin America as a region. So these are topics that I've written about in subsequent works. 2 essays, one that was published in 2021 called Latinidad is Canceled, Confronting an Anti-Black Construct. And the phrase Latinidad is canceled comes from an Afro-Mexican activist, thinker, poet, creator named Alan Peláez López, who has become a great inspiration to me. At the time of Relational Undercurrents, I was pushing back as a Latin Americanist in academia who's affiliated with the Department of Caribbean Studies against the concept of Latin America, but also, as I later developed in more academic writings, but by extension, the category of Latinx, Latinx, Latino, Latine, Latinx, where basically like that sort of assumes Latin America as a fixed geography. So on the one hand, I included numerous US Latinx artists in the show, and by that I mean Dominican American, Puerto Rican and Cuban American, according to traditional understanding of the term. And there was a big conversation around PST, around Latino and Latin American in dialogue and in conversation with each other, but not so much, again, sort of questioning the concept of Latin America and by extension of Latinx, Latinx. The exhibition then aimed to draw out relations between the art of the Caribbean islands rather than feeding into a trope of isolation that is common, for example, in discussions of Cuba. So here's a map of the islands. And so the idea was to tell a story about art that began from the islands. And then, of course, the islands are the point of entry by Columbus in 1492. And the very first kind of stop was actually in the Bahamas. So also thinking back to that moment and really kind of problematizing what I later came to call, following a scholar named Jose Buscaglia Salgado, the segregation of the Caribbean from Latin America, and that within kind of discourse of Latin America, really it is the Spanish-speaking islands that are considered to be part of this imagined community, and not at all Jamaica, and especially not Haiti. And again, this is I've written more extensively about this. And when I started the project and I would do presentations of it, I would often begin with maps and colonial maps. And thinking back, I mean, I love maps so much, but again, this is something sort of more retrospective, thinking back. The trope of isolation is common in discussions of Cuba, for example, of the sort of the island as a sort of single unit. And here it's shown in a performative work by Fermín Ceballos, who lives and works in the Dominican Republic. And so that on the one hand is something that you find commonly, of course, nationalisms creating sort of this sense of unique spaces. And then there's also a narrative that kind of relates to both that and the nationalism, but also colonial history of heterogeneity. And that's been characteristic of critical writings on the cultural production of the Caribbean. There's one very famous example of an author named Antonio Benítez Rojo, who relates the Caribbean to chaos theory. And so sort of saying that that's the kind of model for thinking of the Caribbean. And that was actually taken up by one artist from Curacao, Ellen Spijkstra. She's a Dutch artist who lives in Curacao, a ceramicist. And I would have loved to take this piece, but it was way too expensive to ship. But I included an illustration in the catalog because I think it really also was a great example of some of the aims of the exhibition concept itself, where Spijkstra was sort of calls that chaos theory calls this installation, but really shows that there's quite an affinity between the different elements, these kind of little island ceramic circles and ovals and other forms, round forms. And they all kind of seem to be converging towards each other. And so that was my intent as well, to showcase affinities between artworks that were not necessarily deliberate and in fact not often, unconscious relational undercurrents. That is really what that refers to. And for example, this photograph of Édouard Glissant and Carlos Martiel, who are two of the artists in the exhibition, captures this aim beautifully. It was taken by Glissant's brother, Glissant Martiel, and an artist, Guadalupan artist named Jimmy Robert, who lives in Berlin, were part of the PST Festival of Performance organized by Red Cat, which is an artistic space in Los Angeles. And for that, I curated an additional program titled Representational Acts, which referred to one of the thematic sections of the exhibition. And so it featured performances by these three artists, Martiel, Glissant, and Robert. And the grouping of the artists together aimed to showcase the different linguistic areas of the Caribbean in dialogue. So Martiel is the artist whose body, there are stars on his body. And he is from Cuba, a Spanish-speaking country. Glissant is from Trinidad, and he's Indo-Trinidadian, and he actually lives and works in Toronto, and so he came to this performance festival. And then Robert is from Francophone Guadeloupe, and they all are also three men of color. Martiel's piece was entitled America. I think I have another example. So it consisted of him standing in this dark room, and with stars affixed on his body. They were actually sewn on, and it's so the stars of all the flags of the Western Hemisphere pierced his body, and he stood up in black light for 2 hours, and the audience lined up and came in small numbers to walk around and to experience that. And then, to quote from his statement, America, the title of the piece, proposes a common place where no state claims to be superior to another. All the stars shine brightly under the light that is projected on them. My body transforms itself into a space where diversity and unity converge. His performance, Our Holy Waters and Mine, Édouard Glissant's performance, activates etched jars that were featured as objects in the exhibition. And you can see them here. When they weren't activated, they were on a pedestal on the wall. And his performance is called Our Holy Waters and Mine. The jars are engraved with the names of bodies of water. One set of jars names the waters that are crossed on the journey between India and Trinidad, and another refers to rivers near where the artist had lived. They also all contain the words Kalapani, or black waters, which refers to the Hindu prohibition against crossing the ocean. The performance consisted of Gosin repeating the mantra, "Our holy waters are not the Ganges," and handing out flowers to members of the audience. He then made a bed with those flowers and lay on it. And after he lay down, the audience came with the flowers and covered his body. It was a very moving, beautiful performance. And then Jimmy Robert's consisted of Jimmy, well, in general, his performances call on viewers to cast a critical eye on representation as a mediated process. And Abolibi Below features a Black performer in a white costume designed by the Bauhaus artist Irene Shawinski. And so it's based on the design. The piece functions contrary to expectation, as opposed to the syncopated rhythms associated with Caribbean music and dance. The performer moves through deliberate movements against a droning audio track, fusing avant-garde music and performance with traditional festival arts. It was all like just really extraordinary experiences. Relational Undercurrents marked several firsts for MOLAA. It was the first time that the museum had featured live performance. It was the first time that it had included works from the Anglophone and Dutch Caribbean. Haiti is represented in the collection. And it was the first time the entirety of the museum space was dedicated to a single exhibition. The exhibition occupied all of the galleries except for a little kind of education gallery. And its 4 thematic sections were clearly delineated. They were conceptual mappings, which consisted of artworks that subvert traditional conceptions of space, territory, and geography. Perpetual horizons, featuring the works featured the horizon or metaphors of the horizon, one of the characteristic features of island geography as a recurring trope. Landscape ecologies can reconsider the Caribbean landscape beyond the tourist imaginary. And representational acts, which was also the title of the performance program, as I mentioned, engage with representation as an active process, countering the bias against figuration that prevails, especially in discussions of post-war Latin American art. And figuration is very prominent in the art of the Caribbean, and often in those conversations of Latin American art, because figuration is seen as almost retrograde, then the art of the Caribbean is seen through that lens in a negative light. And so representational acts really intended to celebrate that the active representation as also a mark of agency and of self-assertion. Each of the exhibitions, each of the sections in the exhibition aim to represent about 20 artists. And in order to decide on the checklist, I worked with an artist who plotted MOLAA's galleries in an architectural rendering in order to visualize the space and consider the relationship between the artworks. It was really important for the space not to be overcrowded, for each of the artworks to have like space to breathe and to be experienced fully, and also to be in dialogue with the works near them. And this is so important because of the way that heterogeneity has been such a characteristic part of Caribbeanist discourse in art. So that was extremely important. So this is, I hope you can see the arrow, but this is a door that kind of opens. It's an automatic glass door. And this is where you walk in. And as you walk in, the first section is Perpetual Horizons. And it's reading you as you walk in. And there were works by a Dutch artist, a Cuban, I mean, not a Dutch artist, an artist from Curacao, from the Dutch island, by Nadia Huggins from the Anglophone Caribbean, and by Humberto Diaz from Cuba. And so that was meant to sort of bring you in to the theme of the exhibition, of these linguistic areas and dialogue with each other, but also in the dialogue that called attention to coherence and to affinities in the work. And again, even though they are not, these artists don't know of each other, but their use of common tropes, and of course living in similar environments and ecosystems. So basically you walk through the gallery, and typically a trajectory would be to go into this room, and this was conceptual mappings. There were some pieces from Perpetual Horizons here as well. So this section kind of was Perpetual Horizons, and then you over here conceptual mappings, going all the way through the back. And then the idea was to continue the trajectory this way into landscape ecologies, and then going back out to these smaller galleries that feel like a little bit more like a hall, or at least that they're more rectangular and narrow in shape. And here you're back in Perpetual Horizons, keep walking towards Perpetual Horizons. This is the galleries with representational acts. And then in the back here are the end of Perpetual Horizons, including a room size installation by Janine Antoni. And then here you can see the whole configuration. And these were so beautiful. We thought of including them in the exhibition catalog, but it was too much work design-wise, but they're a great teaching tool. And the configuration changed. Not in all cases, but in some cases it did. But it was a great just floor plan and map of the exhibition. Something that happened that I didn't foresee was that the museum closed this space off with a rope. And so it ruined the kind of movement that I had planned, and they did that. I was a guest curator, so I didn't have too much of a say, and I was curating from afar. And then over here, I hope you can see the arrow, but they opened a door. And so that also was a little bit not in the plans for me. But overall, I mean, I'm very happy with how the installation turned out. It was a very special way of organizing that really made, it just gave so much importance to the artists. And that was another important thing for me, that it's the Museum of Latin American Art, and that these artists belong there, that they are that they're integrated, and it was really asking for us to think much more broadly about the way that these territories are conceived and considered. I'm happy to highlight also site-specific work, and everything here is a labor of love. Sofia Maldonado came to Long Beach. I wasn't in town because I live on the East Coast, so the education director, Gabriela Martinez, made this possible, made the production of the mural possible. by getting the materials and finding a crew to help. And this is not, I mean, this is a massive wall. You can see that it's a wall on the outside near the parking lot, and the mural is still there. It's still looking good, not as vibrant, but it was very special. And also the date of 2017, of course, is the date of the major hurricanes in the Caribbean, culminating with Maria, which took place, Hurricane Maria, about 3 days after the exhibition opened. And there were a number of Puerto Rican artists in town for the exhibition who were then, couldn't go back. And in some cases, one artist didn't hear from her mother in more than a week. So it really also kind of highlighted these very challenging circumstances of environmental injustice. So, and the mural itself was related, it was a critique, the title at least, of a kind of an economic policy in Puerto Rico that was imposed by the United States. So then we also were able to produce a piece by Angel Leonardo from the Dominican Republic. And so this is a piece that's owned by a private collection, and it's called Antil. And each of these pots has this modernist type base that holds a plant, each of them a different plant endemic to the Caribbean. And so that was extremely special. It was an archipelago of plants, and that greeted the visitors as you walked in, and producing this piece and also keeping the plants thriving was something that I'm really grateful to the museum for having made possible. The plants were, like I said, at the door, but they're not next to the visitor the visitor desk. And the person who worked there, named Tony, took loving care of the plants, and they really thrived under his watch. And then when the show was over, the staff from the museum took the plants home, and that was really a very kind of special takeaway. Haitian American artist who lives in Berlin now, Jean-Ulrich Désert, created this wonderful map in response to the exhibition proposal. It's not in the catalog, unfortunately, because he was still working on it. And so when the catalog went to press, what was finished is a detail of the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So that's what gets illustrated. But the piece itself is astounding. It's made on vellum, and depicts a map of the region, which he conceived of in dialogue with the exhibition proposal that I sent him. I had seen other work by Jean-Ulrich, and we didn't have budget to commission artworks, and the Getty rules for the production of commission pieces was that they would be destroyed at the end of the exhibition. So it wasn't something in our budget. And I asked the artists for specific works that I'd seen, but in studio or portfolios. But in this case, he did this of his own volition, and it is a labor of love. It's a very special map that really also calls attention to the fragmentation of the region, and those red lines that you see are borders, maritime borders of around the different insular spaces and continental spaces. And so I also wrote, co-authored an article with a scholar named Elizabeth DeLufree, who is a professor of English at UCLA, and she is she's really one of the major architects of the scholarship on the archipelago. The archipelago as a trope, as a construct, is very much indebted to the thought and writings of Édouard Glissant, who's was a poet and philosopher from Martinique. And so Glissant wrote, among many essays and books, The Poetics of Relation. And so the Relational Undercurrents makes reference to that. There's other ways that the archipelago is not emphasized, not just in his work, but in the work of other Caribbean thinkers, including Kamau Brathwaite from Barbados, who wrote The Unity is Submarine. And he and Derek Walcott, Glissant, others look to find connections in the Caribbean, and knowing they were there, but also having the limitations of the linguistic zones, as well as the kind of insular geography, where sometimes, to go from adjoining islands, you might have to fly to Miami and back. Or it is access in the region is not easy, and so these are different ideas that are alluded to in the map. The rainbow, I don't think I have details here in this presentation, but the rainbow at the bottom has text from major authors like Maurice Condé, from the French-speaking Caribbean, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Colombian Nobel laureate, and Derek Walcott, who was from St. Lucia and also winner of the Nobel Prize. So it was also an homage to the intellectual history, but also to the grim history of enslavement by making this cartouche in the shape of the map of Africa, and calling attention to this region as an African diaspora space, and a space that had faced extremely challenging environmental devastation and extraction, to the point of, and so each of the islands actually, and the continental spaces as well, you see gold coins to call attention to these grim aspects of colonial history. And there's also a detail, can't find it. It might be around here, but I mean, I think this one is oil rigs, but there's also references to oil spills, the Exxon Valdez or others, and some of the flora and fauna, and then a very big distinction between the blue of the water out on the edges, and then the waters of the Caribbean region itself as white, as dying. And here we have references also to coral, and then to fish. This fish, it's a fish skeleton, and then here is the sick coral over here. So it's really an amazing work of art, a very, very important, and also just I felt it so, I was so grateful that the artist took the care and love to create this very special map in dialogue with the exhibition. And then the artist Christopher Cozier, who I have collaborated with, we were co-curators of an exhibition in 2011 at the Art Museum of the Americas in Washington, DC, called Wrestling with the Image, Caribbean Interventions. And really it was that 2011 moment and working with Chris that led me to start, thinking about curating the Caribbean. At the time, that exhibition was funded by the World Bank, but the caveat was that it could only include member nations. So basically in the Hispanic Caribbean, Cuba is not a member nation, and Puerto Rico doesn't have independence, and so we ended up not including the Dominican Republic, and just simply not including the Spanish Caribbean in that exhibition. But in general, it really kind of brought to life some of the challenges, both mapping the region. I mean, maps are clearly something that I really respond to and think about a lot. In this particular case, this piece is called New Level Heads, and it was a piece that was meant to be portable. It was actually, he sent in the designs, and it was produced in the museum and beautifully lit, like you see, but it's also interactive. So the the sticks, you can push them and they swing back and forth. And the work comments on rising sea level, mobility, social relation. It is something that really continues themes that the artist Christopher Crozier has been developing over the course of his whole career. And then this was the piece by Martial that was included in the exhibition. In fact, this is the piece that's in the catalog. The exhibition itself included featured video documentation of this performance. And the video documentation, so you see that he's standing upright in a gallery that's like a white cube space. And these threads give the illusion of piercing his body. So they sort of extend from outside and then converge, and then behind him continue and converge on a single point, like a one-point perspective. So the footage itself is really gruesome. It's difficult to watch, and it's also and I really appreciated having it in the show, because when you see the photograph, it gives a very different impression. So they're both really complementary works of art. And you can see this doctor who comes in, and just the way that he's measuring and his white hands against the black body, but also the artist, when we did the performance of the stars, he hired Gabriela Martinez, again, education coordinator, who's so amazing, found somebody who was an expert on piercings to come in, and she affixed all the stars. And when she saw this video, she couldn't believe it, because it's basically like these, hands that are extremely, like, I don't know, I don't want to say clumsy, but that's kind of what it looked like just, kind of poking the skin, and it takes a long time. And she said that there was like that had a person who was an expert on piercing, it wouldn't have been such a gruesome process, but it very much made a really powerful impression. And then the artist here shown from within the video documentation, and you can really have a sense of that, the way that those threads just basically make this body, this person, this man, look like he's trapped. In this case, it looks more like a fishing net almost, but in the case of sort of a finished photograph, it's meant to be an allusion to Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man as the model of a kind of perfect manhood. And in this case, it's a sort of a Black man who's trapped by this system of representation that is the contribution par excellence of the Italian Renaissance, of one-point perspective and three-dimensional renderings, but that really call attention to how the gaze itself and the way that we look at art is so much tempered and directed by European conventions that are honestly violent. And there's a very well-known book by a theorist of decolonial studies named Walter Mignolo called The Darker Side of the Renaissance. And I've been an art historian for a long time. I studied this as an undergraduate, began taking courses in art history as a teenager. And the kind of coincidence of 1492 to the kind of and the 15th and early 16th century, which is the apogee of the Italian Renaissance, to the fact that this is the moment of genocide and enslavement and colonization of the so-called New World, is not something that we learned in class, and that really took people in other fields to point out and to make visible, and then artists like Martial to make that point come across incredibly vividly, using his body and subjecting himself to pain and challenging circumstances. The footage is gruesome, as I mentioned, but there were other works in the exhibition that were very whimsical. So one of the things about the exhibition that was so special was that there were a number of interactive pieces and so what was really ended up being really lovely is that the pieces were really appealed to children. And so in this particular case by Charles Jujas Alvarado, the wooden objects that are hanging from those metal contraptions that he designed are they are interactive, and when you pull them apart, they make bird sounds, and each of them makes a different sound. And so at any given moment, especially when children were around, the gallery would be filled with this, with the bird calls. And I had seen the piece in the studio and as very, very different looking work, and I loved it. And he basically conceptualized a whole new sculpture that could be sort of played with safely and installed in ways that wouldn't compromise the artwork. And I'm so grateful to him for that. And I'm also grateful to Lynn Perotti. I had seen a piece in her website called Thirst, and it was like the cost of clean water consumed by municipalities for 100 gallons. So the first work that she did was from 2014, and they're etched on metal plates. And I said, can I borrow that? And it was with a collector. So she said, let me make a new version, and I'm going to update it for 2016. And then she realized after promising the piece that the information of how much does a gallon of water cost at any given place was incredibly costly. And so she sort of scrambled to actually, she ended up having to pay hundreds of pounds. She lives in London, in order to get this information, but the actual cost was much more like thousands. And so it was a great story, and really also telling the jump in prices, and then places like Havana where the cost of water had actually gone down. And then Tony Capellan, whose stunning installation are an icon of environmental art. And so this is Mar Invadido, which was actually one of the promotional images that we used for the exhibition. And so these are works that where the artist collected the debris that fell into the ocean and washed up on shore. And specifically, there's a river near where this beach was, where they washed up, the Osama River, where people live precariously along its edge. And whenever there's heavy rains, their houses flood and things are washed away. And basically his entire artwork was made with these different objects. And here is the artist on a trip that I took in 2016, showing me where he sourced his materials and picking up different things, and in this case, a little toy in his hands. And Tony Capellan very unfortunately passed away at during about the first month or two of the exhibition. It was such a tragedy. His piece was featured in the American Airlines in-flight magazine, and I had saved it for him, and I had been collecting them, and it just, sits in my house, and it makes me sad every time. And we also recently lost Jorge Pineda, another Dominican artist, and there have been just too many people gone too soon among the arts community in the Dominican Republic. And Jorge's anatomy lesson was one of the highlights of the exhibition as it was presented in its first venue at MOLAA. This was obviously, as you can see, an impermanent work, and eventually, that got used up. And he had produced 2 skeletons, and we talked about shipping both and including one of them in another venue, but the shipping costs were prohibitive. And so it ended up only being featured at Long Beach at MOLAA, not at the traveling exhibitions, but it basically showed let me see if I have another one here, from the beginning and then more towards the end of the exhibition. But the skeleton is chalk, made of chalk covered in gold leaf, and the proportions were after the size of the tallest man ever recorded. And so we, just a little anecdote was that we had the table ready, but somehow didn't realize that the skeleton would be quite that large, and so the table had a kind of seam because it needed to be extended, and only I saw it, but it was just a funny reminder. These are the things that happen when you install such a complex show, that everything can go wrong, and that might just happen. The piece reflects on mortality. It also reflects on extraction. There's so many layers, and it takes on new meaning now that Jorge is no longer with us. He died just last month, and there is currently in the city of Santiago de los Caballeros in the Dominican Republic, in a beautiful venue called the Centro León, a retrospective exhibition of his work. And so that other skeleton that he produced is currently on view, and I'm hoping the show's open until June, and I'm hoping to have a chance to visit and to really pay my respects to his memory. It is really such a tragedy. He passed away in his early 60s, and really it's a major loss. But I have been thinking a lot about this piece. There was something about it that was so whimsical. And I mentioned before the children who went to MOLAA, who loved the bird calls, and they obviously also loved this chalkboard and chalk piece. And then the Mexican community, when they came in November around the Day of the Dead, felt super connected to it because of that tradition from their own heritage. The work is also has a title that references European art, anatomy lesson, and that's anatomy lesson that was a genre in Dutch painting, and there's also really famous US American painting around the anatomy lesson. And then, but it's after Joseph Beuys, and Beuys, this German artist of the post-World War II period, who basically is known for kind of wild performance, different genres of performance, but he wrote the following. So he basically did a performance with chalkboards where he spoke to the audience and answered their questions and wrote on the chalkboards as he answered. And he wrote on one of them, this one is from the collection of the Tate, "He who in 1972 can live carefree and sleep peacefully despite knowing that 2/3 of humanity are hungry or dying of starvation, while a large proportion of the well-fed third must take slimming cures in order to stay alive, should ask himself what kind of man one is, and whether, moreover, he is a man at all." And so I read that kind of quickly, but it's basically a critique of people who kind of sleep easy while others suffer. But I think that in this piece, Pineda was extending that critique to Beuys himself, in especially that kind of conceit of the artist, like as teacher drawing on the chalkboard. And here, and this was a piece that was in the section called Representational Acts. He basically gives the audience agency, and it really calls attention to how much what we have to say together as a collective and as individuals is also worth listening to, and how important then agency and representation are in current art and the way that it communicates.